Well, Bruce, we're going to start at the top of the hour. We're a minute out, and hopefully we'll have some others join us. But again, recorded, and I have the recording ready to go on the next one. But I didn't want to release it until we'd done this because I didn't want to sneak peeking and saying, "Oh, I don't need to go this afternoon." So anyway, so Bruce, take it away. Five major changes, and you're all set up to be able to do your share screen.
Okay, all right, that sounds good to me. Well, I've been asked to talk about the 5 missional shifts, and it's been my observation that we're in the midst, and this has been percolating for a number of years, but I think dramatic shifts in culture in the world take first a little bit of time to percolate, and then to begin to gain momentum, and then to see something beginning to take place. And the difficulty with these kind of shifts, I think we're in, and we never know if we're in them or not, quite frankly, but the shift that seems like we're in is similar to the whole shift that I would equate it to, like the Enlightenment period. When you're in those kind of shifts, you really don't know what's going to be coming out. So when we talk about the church being in the middle of this shift, and so okay, so what do we become? The real truth of it is we don't know. We just don't know. But it seems like something's happened. And so in this whole missional church discussion, I've often been asked people will also ask me, what is this missional church? What is the missional church? And how I've often said, I think about times I've described this to people. And I think I'm speaking very eloquently and very clearly and just wonderfully. But I notice their eyes beginning to kind of glaze over as I go on and talk. And then their eyes seem to roll to the back of their head. And I just imagine what they're hearing me say is blah, 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 blah. Because it's difficult. I think it's extremely difficult to try to explain what in the world we mean. So the group that I work with, we have all had this experience, and we said there's got to be a way to help to bring some clarity to what in the world we're talking about. And that's what gave birth to what we call the 5 missional shifts. It's not an all-inclusive list. It may not even be an accurate list, but it's what we have found gives some grounding to what we're talking about. Plus, I think the shifts, and I'd love to have more. I'm in some of these discussions. These shifts may have some cultural biasness because I'm from a Western culture, and that's what I'm experiencing and speak out of. But I think they're translatable to other cultures. At least they seem to be in some of the countries I've talked to or have had associations with, like India and some other places and all. And so that's what we want to look at tonight are the shifts, the 5 missional shifts. But I want to just take a few moments as we look at this. Oops, yeah, and I'll give you the first slide, but there we go. To look at what our current realities are. And these are just some of my thoughts. And you may have some other current realities that hit you. But one of the things that we've talked much about over the last 15 years is postmodernism, that we're in a time where modernity is not held up as a way of living, but we're in a postmodern era that I'll just leave it at that. The second thing is we are seeing, and this has started with a lot of young folks exiting the church, and we'd assumed from that they were leaving the faith, and that doesn't seem to be the case. The people are exiting the church, but they're looking for something in the faith. perhaps I would say, how I would define this, they're looking for a new expression of the church or a new ancient expression of the church. But we're seeing that I would contend that, and this goes to really the last point I've put down there, that COVID's influenced this even more so. I've often said that to break an addiction, you have to be clean. The beginning of freedom really is being clean for 40 days, and that can break it. Doesn't mean you won't return to it, but it can break it. And in some ways, forgive me for the way I say this, COVID has broken people's addiction to going to church. And so I think COVID's had an influence, because I've talked to a number of pastors who are saying, we're not seeing our people, number of our people return. And so it's going to be interesting what happens there. Also, we've seen the whole thing, the whole tragedy of the exposure of abusive church leadership. And Christianity Today has been doing this podcast series on the rise and fall of Mars Hill. And it's not just saying Mars Hill is the whole problem. It's just, it is one symptom of something of abusive church leadership that has risen, that's been more and more uncovered. I've often, when we think about this, I recall a professor I had in Wheaton Graduate School, and his name was Walter Elwell, brilliant theologian. And I remember him saying to us, and this was back in about 1980, he said it was the time of the rise of evangelicalism and evangelicals and all. And he said, you know, in the 50s and 60s, the liberal church did not handle money, sex, and power very well. He says it's going to be interesting to see how the evangelicals handle money, sex, and power. And he was really prophetic in what he said there, because we're seeing some of the abuses that has taken place. And then the greater awareness, and especially since the murder of George Floyd, greater discussions on the whole issue of systemic racism, and just systemic racism. And I've mentioned COVID. And so those are some of the realities that I identify as causing a seismic shift within the church today. I don't know, maybe you have some others that you want to add. Is there any others that you might want to add, or something that comes to mind for you as I talk about this?
Bruce, I just wonder about, it seems to me that there's more divisiveness across denominations than I remember at any time in my history, as far as theological theological differences that are really fellowship breaking for some people. And it might just be my imagination, but it seems like there is more divisiveness than I remember. As far as differences of what theologically is right, you know, a theological view or.
I think you're onto something there. I mean, and there's more divisiveness within the church with the whole political environment that we're in, and the COVID environment. I mean, I'm hearing pastors who are in anguish if they do a no mask or a mask guidelines, whatever side people lean. There is a divisiveness, a division that's taking place.
Critical race theory. Can you give an overview of what it's all about?
Can I hear it? I'm sorry.
Can you give an overview of what critical race theory is all about? You're not hearing me?
I'm not clear on what an overview.
An overview of critical race theory.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't want to get into too much of that, but let me just simply say, my understanding, critical race theory is a theory of that is used in a higher academic, meaning college, graduate school, PhD level, to study the effects of racism and how that and systemic racism. From my understanding, it really isn't something that can even be taught in a grade school, high school. It's a way of studying and thinking that really doesn't translate to others. And so, yeah, the whole debate of critical race theory, really, this is my understanding. The whole really concern about it in the grade schools really is more issues of racism, and not, but it's being said in terms of critical race theory as being the bad thing. Is that, I don't know if that's clear, but, and it's sharing my thoughts on that, and not necessarily the official definitions of it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And so what we talk about is these 5 missional shifts, and that's what I want to take some time to talk about with you tonight. And these are the 5 ones. I want to just give you a quick look at them, and then we're going to unpack them a bit, not completely, because there's just a lot in each one to really digest and think through. But, and as we're talking about these shifts, again, I always like to say, they're not shifts of away from and saying, this is bad and this is good. We're not saying that. We're saying a shift of emphasis, because we all want churches to grow, right? I mean, you want to grow. So I'm not saying, no, growth is bad. I'm saying that the emphasis upon church growth is what needs to shift. So we talk about the emphasis shifting from church growth to kingdom impact, from information, education emphasis to an emphasis on formation, being formed in the image of God. From a emphasis of making members or making ministers to making missionaries. Shifting from an emphasis of centralized mission and centralized really leadership and structures to decentralized mission or leadership and structures. And then lastly, moving from being culturally relevant emphasis to an emphasis of being culturally prophetic. So those are the 5 we want to jump into. And as we begin to jump into these, we're an intimate enough group, small enough group that I am open to if you have questions or you have some insights that would be helpful for us, I'm open to you for, just jumping in and sharing tonight with me. And so first I want to look at church growth to kingdom impact. As you know, in the 1980s and all, there was a real focus on church, the whole church growth movement. And it was what I would say, and I didn't mention this morning, but I meant to, it was what I would call continuous change model. And what I mean by that is, it was saying this is what the church is, but we can begin to do some things within what's taking place, and continuously, as the church continuously develops, can bring some, the word that comes to mind, improvements. I don't necessarily want to use that, but we can do some enhancements, some focuses within the church to see it grow and to help bring it to growth. And really, I think what we're looking at for in the shift to kingdom impact is what I would call discontinuous change. To graphically talk about it, it's almost like we've got to blow it up and rebuild. And I'm not talking that drastic. What I'm saying, we're going to have to not just say tinker around, but I think there's some dramatic things that need to take place on that. And so as we look at kingdom impact, back in the 60s and I'm sorry, back in the 80s, it was really talked about, you know, how do we get people to come? There was a belief that if we could get people into the doors of the church, that their involvement in a worship service, in small groups or Bible study or Sunday school or whatever, however churches did the smaller gatherings, and having them involved in church would form them to carry out loving God and loving their neighbor. So that was the concept. And then in the early 2000s, around 2004, I think it was, Bill Hybels from Willow Creek, and I know he's fallen on hard times and all, but he had some good things to bring to the church. And he did a study of his ministry called the Reveal Study, he called it. And what they found was, what they believed in the left side chart was that as people got more involved with church, as their spiritual behaviors changed, so they were attending, they were serving, they were giving, they were evangelizing, these kind of things. What would take place is their spiritual attitudes to love God and their love their neighbor would also would grow in a similar way as it shows in that left chart. What they found was what took place is over on the right side, the right side of the chart, and that is that spiritual growth, being involved in a church and all, did not, their spiritual growth did not follow the level of involvement they were in. And so what we understand from the study was what the church, just getting people involved in the church, first getting people coming to church and being involved in church, was not bringing about people being formed into the image of God. And so I often said, I have to respect Hybels for this. And I know he's been very discredited in all of what's come out about him. But when he had brought this study, I've often said, I would most likely have burned the study not to let people know that what I was doing wasn't working, but instead he published it. And I have to respect someone who did that. Now, the thing that troubles me the most is we've known this study's been around for at least 12 years. And pastors know this study, and yet they keep doing the same thing. And to me, that's a tragedy. That just simply getting people into a building, getting them involved, isn't really working. And we could go into deeper parts of why that is and some of that, but I'm just hitting the surface right now. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about kingdom impact is we have to understand what is the gospel according to Jesus. And that really is the kingdom of God is at hand. It's not simply, as N.T. Wright talks about, it's not simply saying the gospel is accepting Jesus Christ as your Savior. Is that part of it? Absolutely. Is it an important part? Oh, of course it's an important part. But it's just a part. Because what we're talking about here is the gospel is about what Jesus said is, I've come to establish my kingdom, my reign and my rule. I've often said, I've often said You know, when Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, it was basically saying the kingdom of God is at hand. And there's a new king in town, and his name is Jesus. And so there's a shift of thinking of this in a different way. But what is the impact? The impact, I believe, is how we term it here is seeking the shalom of the city, seeking the shalom of the community, seeking the shalom of the rural area, seeking the shalom wherever we are. And that's finding the well-being, you know, as we understand shalom being the well-being. And we can break that down further if we wanted to matters of the outside bubbles of matters such as justice. Kingdom impact is finding justice, reconciliation, restoration, freedom. And in freedom, what I would include would be salvation, freedom from sin, and also freedom from the tyranny of the evil one. Inclusion, meaning all are welcome. Jubilee, following the whole concept of Jubilee in the Old Testament, economic justice and all those things. That would be what we're talking about. That's the kingdom impact that we're talking about shifting to. So before I move forward on this, let me just pause. Are there any questions, any thoughts that you have, any reactions?
I guess I better unmute. So I have a question. So it'd be interesting to see how a church goes about actually moving into something like that. Let's say you've got a church like mine that's got, you know, I don't know, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 members, lots of senior adults that are been traditional. They're very traditional. Lots of new young couples that are also very traditional. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, but they're also real interested in these topics. So I'm just curious, you know, it's a totally different language. And so I'm just interested, I guess I'd be interested how a pastor or church staff would even begin to move a church in this direction without it scaring people away. I'm just interested. So
I want to be respectful. I want to answer that question. I want to dialogue on that question. But can we wait till the end? Because I think after we catch the other shifts, that question becomes even more important. Okay, I think because you're asking the right question. That's a huge question on that. But and if I forget at the end, remind me, okay? Because I don't. If I forget at the end, it's not because I'm trying to avoid it. I'm dying to dive into it right now with you. Let me go through the rest of the shifts. The next one is from education to formation. And as we talk about this shift, what we're saying on this is that information has been understood to be or education is so important. If we can educate and we can inform people, if they can gain the knowledge, it will bring about change in their life. I recently heard a denominational leader say, if we can just teach people the right theology, they'll live right. And I'm going, no, they won't. No, they won't. There's a lot of people who know the right theology that just are not living right. Knowledge does not bring about, I'll say it definitively, but knowledge does not bring about formation. Knowledge is important. I mean, I think all of us would agree. We've all been to BGU or some higher education. We've all been involved in that, and we've benefited from it. But it's not as the essential part of formation. And so we have to understand there's a difference that formation and that information is the acquisition of knowledge, but formation really is a matter of the heart. And the matter of how I do live, and what are my concerns. And so what we're talking about in this shift is we don't want to say what do people need to learn, but what kind of formation do we? In the organization I work with, our pedagogy, we believe really I'm breaking all my rules here, okay? I realize that, but in this setting, I think it's okay, because this is more of information. And we believe that when we're doing formation with people, teaching no more than 10 minutes. And then we move into something more. It might be a discussion, interaction. It might be something formational. It might be reflection or something. In fact, I've at times found myself, what I like to do, I don't do it as much as I'd like to, but if I'm preaching, I sometimes like to stop after 10 minutes and just maybe have people journal on what are the things that have informed you. What are some things that rose up for you as you've heard me speak? And so to help them to learn, to reflect on that. And so there's a shift that we're talking about in formation, and that would be, spiritual formation. And this is just a diagram I thought I'd throw in to kind of help to give some understanding what we're talking about. And that is understanding the me. And often the me is the false self in the terms of Merton and Richard Rohr and some of these other folks writing on this. And it's moving to the true self as God had created us to be. How do we move through that? Well, beginning to live with the disciplines of the faith. And when I say that, I always like to say disciplines actually have no power. There's nothing to the disciplines, because just doing the disciplines aren't going to bring about anything. You probably had that experience. I know as I was a younger believer, I thought, well, if I pray, if I just will myself to pray, that's going to do something, and just to will myself to do something is. But disciplines are a place to open us up to enter into the sacred space. And I would say, from this morning's question, a sacred place of prayer. And I see prayer not so much as intercession, but prayer is a place prayer is the place of the sacred space to be with God in silence and solitude and listening. It's really the place where Jesus would be when he says, I listened to what the Father said and I say it. I see what the Father does and I do it. That there's this relational union that can take place. And through that sitting, transformation can take place. And that's a mystery that I can't control. But it's a vision of my best self, the true self. And so there's a lot to unpack again there, but that's what we're looking at is the forming of people, and doing that through in means of entering into disciplines of the faith. And so I'll pause there. Well, let me just keep going, unless you have some comments, quick comments or all. Okay, let me go. This next one is the whole idea of moving from making members to making missionaries. And this Andrea, this really will tie into your question, because often what we see is the goal of churches are to make members, to make ministers, with often the focus upon getting people involved in the church. What we're trying to do is we want to equip people to minister within the church structures. That's what I've been talking about here. Excuse me, let me get some power onto this computer. Okay. And so many, as I said, many churches focus upon equipping people. They've developed expectations and programs requiring members to participate. And churches often work to get people involved in areas of their interest and talent, but the overriding issue is getting involved in staff initiated ministries and programs. That's basically how the church works. And we're talking about a shift. And this shift is moving away from how do we get people involved? That's not the question that we sit with. We sit more with how do we connect and release people to live their call or their passion? And I would even add their God-given call and the passion, the desire, that deep desire of their heart that God has knit into them. That talks about in Psalm 139. It's a shift, really, programs, ministry focus on meeting needs within the church. How do we meet the needs within the church is often talked about in staff meetings. And I've been in many of those staff meetings. I've been a part of that. To structures of small communities focusing on a shared call outside the church, connecting to the heart of the need of their context. And obviously, that's a whole different conversation. And fitting people in ministry roles created by leadership in a program built by leadership for a purpose decided by leadership. And maybe this is overstated, but it gives us the understanding there. 2, people uniquely and creatively serve mission together as they discern the Spirit in their gifts and calling. That right there is just a huge shift. And that's why I wanted, before I responded to Andrew's question, I wanted us to, this is an important part of what you're asking right there. And so we're saying here is in this shift, it's ascending God who sends us. And so empowering people is helping to discover their life lived out call. And when I talk about call, we talk about 3 types of calls. And because the first 2 are calls that are for universal calls, I guess I'd say, to people who are following Jesus. The first one is the call to follow him. As Jesus would say to his disciples, follow me. To which we say, evangelism is all about calling people to follow God. But there's also another call, and that's the common call. And that is, the common call, it is true for all of us. All of us are called to love our neighbor. All of us, I believe, are called to care for the poor. All of us are called to give to those in need. There are those things which we focus on, that we say all believers are called to these kind of ways and behavior. And then thirdly, we call the life thread, or a missional call, you could call it, but we like the life thread call. That's the unique way a person lives out their call in the community and in the world. It's the unique call that God gives to us. And it doesn't necessarily mean like a call, I'm called to the ministry, but it can be, here in Chicago, one of the things that I've always had a sense of calling towards is those who live on the margins. And some of that comes out of the whole thing we talk about in regards to our deepest wound connects us to the wounds of the world. And as I shared this morning, I was born, and it's harder to see it in Zoom, but I don't have a right ear. I have a little bit of a nub there because they started doing surgery and all, but I don't have I was born without a right ear. And that makes me different from other people. And what I discovered early in life is people don't like different people who look different. And so therefore I ran across in early age and even junior high school, being ridiculed, being bullied, being, I think it's a fair word, be ostracized at times. And that was a deep wounding of what it's like to be marginalized. And so what is it? I just am drawn to people on the margins. So here in Chicago presently, I'm doing some work with some of the homeless shelters just because I connect there. That's a passion in my heart. Now I wouldn't say I've been called to mission homeless shelters. I'm called to the margins, but it can find expressions different ways. And so we're talking about as we go from every member every person a member to every person a missionary is helping people find what is the mission God has for you. What's he set, and then what's the expression of it for you. Let me just run through these next two, and then we'll take some time. Unless you have a burning question, I'll just keep going. The next area we talk about is a shift from centralized mission to decentralized mission. And this is this shift is, maybe I've said about all of them, it's really, really difficult, and it really hits upon church structures. We talk about this whole idea to decentralize requires empowering people with responsibility and authority to set direction and practices. And by people, I mean just people who are involved. The shift of empowering people, by definition, is a power shift. And so we're really looking at the idea that we are shifting away from the centralized leadership model that it is the pastor and the elders, so that in those kind of model churches, who really make the decisions of what is our mission as a church, what are the ministries we will take on. It's moving away from that to say we want to equip and empower people to live out their call in groups of people who have a common call. If that makes sense. We're talking about missional groups being folks who grow in deeper union with God, who grow in greater intimacy and authenticity as a community, and they also live out a common call or a common mission together. This is different than a Bible study or a small group or a mission group, or like a mission focused group. This is saying we're going to live life together, so to speak. And by that, I don't mean they necessarily live in the same house together, but they live together as far as being a community. And so what we're talking about is, in this shift, is really guiding people into the thinking, what is God doing and how do I join him? And what is my life thread calling, and how does that fit into what is God doing? And the question of how am I formed or designed and gifted? created. And I've said that the result is the merging of these questions for a person to live on mission. This changes how we look at discipleship. It changes it greatly. It's not preparing people simply to fit into a mission within the church. And it also begins to create difficulty within the church structures, because with this kind of discipleship, we are directing people out into the community and not to work in the nursery. And we all know we need people to work in the nursery. Moving out of the church into the community and not necessarily working within the church structures for the children's ministry or youth ministries and all. And so this is a shift of how we do church. And that's why I would call it really is a discontinuous change. It's not just trying to fix up what we have. It's saying we are looking at a real change that the church. And so what the church has to start looking at is, I believe, and there are some churches I can point you to. One is in Washington, D.C. called Church of the Savior. Another church that I would recommend people look at is Tampa Underground Church, who have had to ask the question, what is it that we do centralize and how do we decentralize? To make these kind of changes, I often say is, it cannot change. It is very difficult for it to change from the central power structures, meaning the elders, the board, the pastoral staff. It's hard for change to happen there because they all have too much vested into what they're doing right now. They may genuinely want to make this kind of shift, but it's extremely hard for them. And that's why we often talk about change happens on the margins. But if you take the civil rights movement in the United States, it did not happen in Washington, D.C. I mean, decisions had to be made there, but they weren't made until the changes were made on the margins. In Birmingham, in Selma, in places there that all of a sudden rippled into the country and created a movement. And so when we look at this, it's a very difficult shift for church structures. But we have to look at what's centralized, what isn't. And I can go through a whole lot there. I'm just going to leave it at that for right now. That's what I'm looking at is the beginning of figuring out what kind of structure for a church. It's moving away from something like this, where we see top down. We see the big bubble up at the top. It would tend to be your pastoral staff or your pastor, your elders, your deacons, or your whatever you call it, the leadership. And it's kind of a hierarchy. And there's a clear chain of command. There's a clear communication. And there are basic standards, policies, and procedures. And some of these things aren't necessarily bad. What I always say is structure always has to follow movement. The movement always has to lead the way. When I was in a church that went through some major changes, and we were doing things that were extremely, it's just incredible, I would say, and the changes taking place. There came a time where more and more structure was required, and all of a sudden I saw a change take place in which the structured people were really taking on the leadership. And as soon as that happened, I said, we're in trouble. It took a number of years, but stagnation took place because structure led the way. I'm not against structure. I'm just simply saying structure always has to follow movement, and that is messy. That's what this is. When movement leads and structure follows. It is messy because you don't put structure in until you have a mess that says we need structure. And so we talk about the more of this kind of a movement would be the distribution of power that takes place. Localized autonomy, that each individual unit has more autonomy. It becomes organic and adaptable to what's happening. And the emphasis is on smallness and networks. And so that's the movement. The final shift, and then let's have some discussion here. The final shift is one from being culturally relevant to culturally prophetic. And what we're saying is that the church is so enculturated. And I think in our present environment, in our present political environment, no matter what side of the aisle one is on or political venture in, we are in culture, we are culturally captive, the church is. But I go even further that our people within the church, and even our discipleship, I would claim, is caught in the cultural captivity. And when I talk about cultural captivity, often I bring it down to the things such as materialism and consumerism, safety and security, comfort, individualism, pleasure, technology. These are all things I believe that we are captured by. And one of our core courses in our what we call our Beyond series, and that's part of moving people in this shift, is called cultural captivity. And we literally have people list, what is your cultural addiction? Is it safety, security? Is it consumerism, materialism? And we lead them through the 12 steps. We say this is an addiction. We lead them through the 12 steps to break that addiction. I believe that this is an extremely important part of our discipleship process. But the church has become so very, upholding some of these things. Let me give you a simple thing that I've heard taught in churches for years. They say, give 10% to God, 10% to savings, and live on the rest is yours. No, you got to realize to start off with 100% is God's. Now figure out what you're going to do with it. Figure out what you're going to do with it. It may cause you to radically live on 10%. Maybe it's 90%. I don't know. But the idea is we've got to break that enculturation of the church. And so it's moving, and we can't do that by just simply being relevant. Although I'm not saying relevance is not important. It is important. We have to understand and read the culture, what's going on. Dr. King said it the best. I don't know if the best, but I think he said it in a wonderful way. He said the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. We could just sit with that for a good 30 minutes and meditate on that. A very powerful statement for us. But we're called to be prophetic, and that is speaking into the culture. What is it we're to speak into? I believe it is those kingdom values that I listed with the whole slide on shalom. It's to speak in to the well-being of the community. It's to speak into justice and reconciliation and jubilee and inclusion and freedom. To speak to speak to speak as Dr. King would speak, very prophetically about the racism that was taking place, about the wrong of hindering African Americans to vote and those kind of things. Those were prophetic. He was speaking truth into the culture, and that's what we're called to bring as part of that missional church. So those are the 5 shifts. And let me just go back to the original 5 shift slide. So we have that before us for a second. Those are the 5 shifts we're talking about. And so I think Andrew will go right before I just open it up for discussion. Let's just bring up your question again. And if you can remember it, can you kind of reiterate it for us? And unmute yourself. Remember that? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I was just saying, if you have a church like I described, where you've got older members that are they're older, they're traditional, you've got it's a growing church. The church has got a lot of younger members that are also traditional, but also wanting to get more involved and concerned more about the justice issues. They're not so afraid of them as maybe most of your older people. I was just wondering how you change that whole conversation and vocabulary.
Yeah. Let me speak from my experience on this. Not that it is the way, because I don't think there is the way. I think as we're looking, and that's why we put these out as shift. We're not saying this is how you do it. I think what many groups have to do is they have to grapple with these shifts and say, how in the world do we do this? I think first of all, one of the important things is changing the way we disciple people and understanding that basic discipleship. If you're familiar with the interior castle, the 7 mansions and all, 7 castles, or language such as the purgative, luminative, unitive way of spiritual growth. Often the first 3 castles that St. Teresa talks about really is the whole all we do in discipleship, and that is turning a person's heart to God, guiding them to understand who God is and having a relationship with God, and then getting involved in the work, so to speak. And that basically sums up. But we don't go to what Teresa would talk about as the 4th castle, or in the illuminative way, we're saying having deeper union with God. And so a discipleship that's moving people into a deeper union with God. The process that we've developed, or we've worked on, is we have classes, I guess you'd call them, or modules. We've designed 6, but it doesn't even matter which ones people go through. The topic isn't important. It's the formation that's important. And it takes people through a specific topic like cultural captivity, and they have a journal where it teaches them the rhythms of actually living into the rhythms of life. And we say the first thing we have to do is we have to create a missionary heart within people. And that's really a heart for God and a heart for His mission. That can take 3 months, let's say. Then as people develop that, we really take them through a series of what's next. And that is a years long, we're trying to point them as a years long internship where they are involved in what we call a mission group that's designed to teach them how to live in deeper union with God, in authentic community, and on a mission together. So they're learning to do this, and then beginning to launch these types of groups. So I'm giving a long answer, but that's what we found is successful. But at the same time, what I find I have to do is calm church leadership, because that's really working on the margins. Calm church leadership so they're accepting of what's going on and not squashing what's going on. And then eventually we have to begin to address the church leadership and structures. That's kind of how I've seen a way of it working, but there can be other ways. Anyone else want to add into that of what your thoughts or observations?
Well, although you're not hearing me well.
I can hear you now.
Okay, okay. You know, I am just looking back, just going back on your list there, and they all seem so relevant, you know, as we had said this morning. And but this one, culturally relevant, you know, I think that is one of the main problems that the church is experiencing now in terms of people's different opinions of what is culturally relevant. And if the church does not have a ground, as you have said, we need to shift and stay there, it being culturally prophetic, being at a constant where we know this is where God wants us to be, and not being moved around by different waves of ideas. Because what I'm seeing is that if the church is left up to respond to and try to please the different ideas of people of what the church should be, then eventually the church is becoming a laughing stock. It doesn't have any meaning, because it looks just like the world. If you leave it up to people, it looks just like the world. There's no difference.
Well said. Yep. Yep.
Bruce, when you went through on your slide on the shalom, it struck me, and I come from a church growth perspective, so I'm going, okay, what about this? But anyway, one of the things that I noticed about, or I see when I look at that, is it looks to me like this is, and I'm not arguing or pushing back on this, but it looks like this is a societal model here. We're dealing with society of justice and reconciliation, restoration, freedom, inclusion, and individuals have a part of that. I'm not at all arguing that. But when I work with people, individuals, I tend to wrap my head around, how does the gospel hit you in your place? And I was just playing, and I came up with my own 6 that I think is an individualized versus a societal, and at calling, relationships, freedom, the spiritual or the inner life, health or physical, and money. And that covers everything there, but it becomes an individual thing rather than a societal thing. And of course, if they do those 6, it accomplishes shalom there as well. It's the same shalom, but from a different slight perspective.
Yeah. Well, what you've done is great, because what we're seeing is this just gives us a framework to really, how do we function? And what you're saying is, you're finding I need to bring this to an individual level of a person tying to that. That's a great, good observation. I like that.
Thanks. This has been absolutely eye-opening for me. I've felt much of this angst of this isn't working. And I just led a church growth seminar for the Presbyterians this last week, and I mentioned that this morning. And And it really is, I talked about, it's all about relationships now. It's, you know, and the reality is it really always has been. Jesus started with 12, but worked with 3, you know, and poured his life into those 3 and said, okay, now you guys go out and do that. And we hear about those 3 a lot, and we hear almost nothing about the other 9. But that there has been this real, for me, disconnect of how do we deal with a culture that is pushed so far back from the church, and the church that is so embraced, what Marlene said, so has embraced culture that is indistinguishable from culture. And, you know, for me, that the last one, the prophetic relevant versus culturally relevant versus culturally prophetic, is like, oh, that is so where I'm at. It's like, we have got to start saying, guys, this isn't right. This isn't okay. We've got to live different than the culture. We can't be chameleons. We need to speak relevant, but relevant does not mean inclusive, and not like the shalom inclusive, but the inclusive of synchronistic, embrace, everything goes. Hey, here we are. I love you, and I love you enough to let you believe whatever you want to believe and behave however you want to behave, because it's okay, except that it's not.
That really doesn't make any sense.
Right. It makes no sense. And especially it makes no sense for the church when we have some codified, listen, folks, we're supposed to love one another above ourselves, not love ourselves above everybody else.
Yeah.
So.
And love God is the highest form of love, and it determines everything else.
Exactly.
And in some ways, Andrew, coming back to your question, in some ways, if there's still hope that the present church model will work, it's very difficult to introduce this kind of change. You know, in the rooms, we often talk about, when do you hit the bottom? And the statement is, when you stop digging. When you stop digging. And so in some ways, it's like, there's got to come a point in time where, and a lot of pastors deep down know it's not working. And Bill, maybe that's been your experience. Deep down, they know it. They make it, but they don't know anything else.
And they're afraid of anything else because, as you say, it now hits my pension.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
But there is a malaise. There is a need for new. Go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, I was going to say, even though I was kind of using my church as a question, my church, I see a lot of this when you were just talking about this, Bruce. I see my church doing these things. I don't know if they're intentional. Well, I know that it's intentional, but I see these things happening in small ways. My church is a pretty decentralized church. There's never been an authority type structure. It's always been very calling everyone in the church to be on mission. Mm-hmm. So, but I do see, like recently we had, well, I don't even know I just don't even know how to say it, but I see a lot of what you're saying happening at my church. Good. And so it's really, that's encouraging, but I do think that at the same time, I'm thinking about all of the pleas that my church puts out for people to help in the ministry to children, in the ministry to preschoolers, and how many responsibilities there are in the church to keep the church functioning with all the things that we all love, our Bible studies and our I can really see the challenge for a church.
Nope. And there you are.
Sorry. I can really see the challenge for a pastor and church staff as they're trying to juggle all of this and move the congregation toward what you have here, and yet at the same time fulfill all of the ministry needs within that keep the discipleship of the church going.
Yeah.
And when I look at, we are reaching so many young families. Our church is just on fire. Young families, and we have but one of the reasons they're coming is because of the tremendous programs we have for preschoolers and children and babies. And of course, to do that takes a lot of volunteers when you have 6,000 or 8,000 people in the church. So, and babies, coming continually. So I can't just sitting here thinking about it. It overwhelms me, and I'm not on our church staff. I'm just one of the people participating in all of this. So
you can see, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, I'm through.
Oh.
Through.
So you can see that's what I'm talking about would just blow circuits with leadership in your church in some ways. Because you're saying you're trying to move people. We can't get enough people to staff our programs. Well, maybe you need to cut back your programs. I said this morning, I'll say to pastors that the worst thing for the missional group or the missional groups, developing missional groups within your church is small groups and Bible studies. You need to stop them. People, they'll look at me like, you can't be serious. I go, yeah, because they're not bringing about what we're saying for people to live in a deeper union with God, to live in authentic community, and to live on mission together.
They don't bring transformation.
They don't bring transformation.
They educate us way beyond our obedience, to use Nicole's words.
I see that in the I see that in the our group our church calls them life groups. I really see that lack of transformation in my life groups, and it's something I pray about and struggle with. I've talked to our church ministers about it. It's a common, not just mine, but common, and that's so you do say, okay, then what do we do? How do we stop this and get on a different train?
Right. And Bill Hybels never did figure it out. They never did get it fixed. The Reveal study was all about that, and they never did get it turned around.
They tried. They tried.
Kudos for them for doing so. But yeah, they never did, because they're trying to do transformation using an old model that is not transformative.
Yeah.
So I have one more question. I need to get off because my grandchildren are trying to call me, but
Okay.
My other question is, I see this growing trend toward these churches, rather than becoming decentralized and sending people out where they're starting new things. They're starting churches it's their one big church. Like we have a church here in town that has like 60,000 members and different plants all over the city. And the pastor recently, he, their lead pastor of all these churches, he tweeted, liked a tweet that was considered objectionable here in Birmingham, racially insensitive, which is not who he is, but that was the way it was taken. And so the city of Birmingham broke some agreements with him. They were going into some of the projects here in Birmingham, doing things that no one else was willing to do. And because of that one tweet that he did, it influenced the city's perspective of all of those plants. And I wonder, as I see this happening, more and more of these churches, rather than just letting other churches become what they need to be with their own leadership, decentralizing, instead they're holding on to them under their umbrella, which I call not decentralizing. I call that very centralized, when you've got one lead pastor over 20 or 25 different churches. I can't see, and what that ended up doing was casting doubt on all of those churches. And it was in all the newspapers, in the news. And what he did was so minor, seems, but at the same time, it had a huge fallout. in the community of Birmingham. And so I just wonder about that, because I'm seeing more and more of churches using that, what I consider pretty authoritarian, where they've got one lead pastor, and all of these churches that are watching him on a video, rather than.
You muted yourself again.
They're starting, rather than developing their own culturally pastors and church staff that are, and they do have their own staffs, but still they're all linked. So anyway, I just wondered, it just doesn't seem to me like that would fit into what you're presenting here.
That's absolutely correct. That's not what we're talking about.
Dr. Jackson, did you mention the training of pastors as one of the ways in which you could address the problem of pastors being more open to this shifting?
Yeah, I mean, if you're referring to what we do in Rewire, yeah, we work on a couple of levels. Number one, we have a whole discipleship process that move, and I kind of referred to it earlier, that move people. It's a year and a half. It's going to take a year and a half to take the first group through. And people look at me and go, that's way too long. And I say, I don't know any other way to really rewire a person from how they understand church today to, and even the year and a half isn't enough time, but it is a foundational part to move people along. And so we have that process we call Beyond series that people, and then the internship and moving to missional group. But then also you've got to deal with leadership. And so we have the thing called the missional MCL, missional church leadership training leadership. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's for missional, it's for church leaders to understand this whole movement and to be taught in it. And it's a 2-year it's a 2-year cohorts that we take people through. And I think this is the kind of thing, and I would guess, Bill, the things you're doing also is it takes time. It's very labor, time, relational, intense to move people in this shift.
Because I'm wondering, how do you get them to see that they need the change to participate in the program?
Yeah, I think many pastors know something's wrong, and many times what we have to wait to do is find people who are just saying, I can't do this. I mean, I can't do this anymore. This isn't working. And so there becomes what I would call a holy frustration that takes place. So it's connecting with people such as that. I think it's also okay. See you, Andrea.
I hate to leave y'all. I've got someone knocking at the door and my grandchildren calling.
Well, the grandchildren are important.
Okay.
You've hit a question that I can't answer really. Bill, maybe you can, but it just people have to experience it. I talked this morning. People have to come to a point of being in that angst, and I can't. I can't.
My magic wand is broken, man. It ain't working.
Gosh, maybe that is why we don't have the numbers that we have here, because people don't see the need. They're not there.
But we're also in a crack in time between what was and what will be. And during this period, churches like Andrew's church is going to continue to thrive, even though they're not doing the model that is missional, because they're definitely not. They're not doing the model that's missional. They're going to continue to thrive, but that's in this crack. It will eventually, like everything else, that if this paradigm is a sustainable paradigm, it will rise while the other falls. And none of us are going to see it. We will all, not on this side. We'll watch it from somewhere else, but it's going to take significant time. But I think what Bruce has said, and I agree with him because I see it all the time in my consulting work. The pastors have this malaise that it isn't working. And they're all, not all, but many of them are looking for an alternative and they're not seeing one. And I'm excited about, I'll be talking to Bruce about doing some work with my company in terms of doing some interviews and conversations to try and get more and more of this out into the public eye so that they go, oh, that's what it works like. And kind of do some cross-pollination with Bruce and his company. So
I love it. Plus, I think BGU, and this is after I get kind of, I just can't be the new kid in the block with all these great ideas and try to push things. I got to kind of get in there and understand what's going on. But I believe BGU is in a great position to offer training and to get DMIN projects to address this stuff and to research this stuff and to work on this stuff. And let's see what are things we can offer to help in this shift.
Yep. All right, Marlene, we're way past time.
Oh, sorry.
and I'm pulling the plug because Bruce needs to go. We all need to go, but mostly Bruce. This is the second time through. But we will have Bruce back. This has been fabulous, Bruce. Thank you so very much. Can you do us a favor and get us? Are you willing to share your slide deck with us?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I'll send it to you.
That'd be great. Thank you. And we'll PDF it and let people to see it. So. And
for both of you, I would welcome a Zoom conversation individually or together, whatever.
Awesome. Thank you so much, okay. Bruce. And Marlene, thank you for getting this all set up. You did marvelous as usual. Marlene does all the work and I end up sitting in the catbird seat going, wow, wasn't this great? But Marlene's done all the work. So thank you, Bruce. So much. Thank you, Marlene. Y'all have a wonderful evening and we will see you all again soon.
Okay.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.